I'm Emma Rodriguez, 18, and until 3 months ago, I was the family disappointment who barely scraped by in high school. At every family gathering, my mom would shake her head when relatives asked about my future, saying with that familiar sigh, "She's just not gifted like her sister Maria." The words stung every single time, but I'd learned to smile and change the subject. Last week, everything changed when I walked across that stage to accept the first place trophy at the state science competition, beating over 300 contestants from across California. The local news interviewed me, my photo made the front page of our town paper, and suddenly colleges were calling with scholarship offers. But when I got home that night, clutching my trophy and hoping for some acknowledgement, my mom just looked at me with confusion and asked if I'd cheated. That's when I realized this wasn't about intelligence or achievement. This was about something much deeper, and the truth I discovered would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Growing up, everything in our house revolved around Maria. 3 years older than me, she seemed to effortlessly excel at everything she touched. While I struggled with basic algebra, Maria was already taking a P calculus as a sophomore. When I brought home a B+ on a history test, proudly thinking I'd done well, Mom would barely glance at it before launching into stories about Maria's latest academic triumph. "Did I tell you Maria got accepted into the pre-med program at Stanford?" Mom would announce to anyone who'd listen, her chest swelling with pride. The medical school acceptance letter still hung on our refrigerator, even though Maria had started her residency 2 years ago. Every time I opened that fridge, I saw that pristine white envelope with the Stanford logo, a constant reminder of everything I wasn't. Dad tried to be supportive in his quiet way, but work kept him traveling most. Weeks, when he was home, he seemed exhausted, content to let Mom handle our academic lives. "Your mother knows best about school stuff," he'd say with a shrug. Disappearing behind his newspaper or laptop. The comparisons started early. In elementary school, teachers would light up when they saw my last name on their roster. "Oh, you're Maria Rodriguez's little sister." She was such a brilliant student. Then came the inevitable disappointment when I didn't measure up to whatever impossible standard she'd set. Maria wasn't mean about it, that almost made it worse. She'd help me with homework sometimes, explaining concepts with the patience of someone who found everything naturally easy. "Don't worry, Emma," she'd say kindly. "Not everyone can be good at everything. You'll find your thing eventually." But what if I never did? What if being average was just who I was? Mom had her own way of managing expectations. At parent-teacher conferences, I'd sit in the hallway listening to muffled conversations about my potential and lack of focus. Afterward, Mom would drive home in silence, her disappointment filling the car like fog. "I just don't understand it," she'd finally say, more to herself than to me. Maria never needed to be pushed. She just knew what to do. The unspoken message was clear. I didn't know what to do, and maybe I never would. Family gatherings were the worst. Relatives would corner Mom, asking about both her daughters. She'd been talking about Maria's achievements, medical school, research publications, awards. Then her expression would shift when they asked about me. "Emma single quotes S. finding her way," she'd say diplomatically. "She's a late bloomer. Some children just take longer to find their gifts." But her tone suggested she wasn't convinced I had any gifts. To find the irony is that I desperately wanted to make her proud. I studied harder than Maria ever had to, staying up late trying to understand concepts that seemed to click instantly for my sister. But harder work didn't translate to better grades, and Mom's disappointment grew more pronounced with each report card. By high school, I'd almost given up trying to compete. Maria was the smart one, the successful one, the daughter who made moms. Eyes light up. I was just Emma pleasant enough, but unremarkable in every way that seemed to matter to our family. That acceptance became my shield and my prison, protecting me from further disappointment while ensuring I never really tried to break free from those low expectations. Had no idea that everything I believed about myself was about to change. The microscope changed everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. I found it at a garage sale on a Saturday morning when I was 15, buried under dusty textbooks and old kitchen appliances. The elderly woman running the sale noticed me examining it carefully. "That belonged to my late husband," she said softly. "He was a biology teacher for 40 years. I've been hoping someone who'd appreciate it would come along." For $25, most of my babysitting money, carried home a piece of equipment that would unlock a world I never knew existed. Mom barely looked up when I brought it into the house. "What's that old thing?" she asked, focused on paying bills at the kitchen table. "Just something for school," I mumbled, not wanting to explain. I'd learned not to get excited about my interests around her. Disinterest was always crushing. I set up the microscope in my bedroom, on the small desk wedged between my bed and the window. That first afternoon, I spent hours looking at everything I could find. Strands of my own hair, fibers from my carpet, drops of pond water from the park. Each slide revealed intricate worlds invisible to the naked eye, complex structures and patterns that took my breath away. This wasn't like the forced lab experiments at school where we followed predetermined procedures to reach predetermined conclusions. This was discovery. This was wonder. Within weeks, I was checking out advanced biology textbooks from the library, reading late into the night by flashlight after Mom told me to turn off my lights. I started keeping a journal, documenting my observations and forming hypotheses about what I was seeing. The more I learned, the more questions I had. Why did certain bacteria cluster in specific patterns? How did plant cells respond to different types of light? What would happen if I introduced various substances to the water samples I'd collected? I began conducting my own experiments, carefully documenting variables and results. My bedroom became a makeshift laboratory with labeled jars of samples and notebooks filled with detailed observations. I was methodical, thorough, and completely absorbed out at school. I started paying closer attention in science class, though I was careful not to seem too eager. I'd learned that standing out usually led to disappointment, either from teachers who expected Marie-level performance, or from classmates who'd mock any hint of trying too hard. But privately, I was thriving. I discovered online forums where real scientists discussed their research, and I lurked there for hours, soaking up terminology and methodologies I'd never encountered in high school classes. I watched university lectures on YouTube, taking notes as if I were enrolled in the courses myself. The breakthrough came during my junior year when I noticed something strange in the pond water samples I'd been studying for months. There was a pattern in how certain microorganisms behaved when the water contained different levels of pollutants. They seemed to cluster and form protective barriers around themselves. This observation led me down a research rabbit hole that lasted months. I read peer-reviewed papers about water purification, biological filtration systems, and environmental science. I started testing my theory with different contaminated water samples, carefully documenting which organisms thrived and which ones died off. What I discovered was that certain naturally occurring bacteria could be cultivated to break down pollutants more efficiently than traditional filtration methods. It wasn't groundbreaking research. Similar studies existed, but I was developing it independently, with no guidance except my own curiosity and determination. The idea of entering the state science competition didn't occur to me until I overheard two seniors talking about it in the hallway. They were complaining about how much work it would be, how competitive it was, how only the genius kids ever won anything. That night, I researched the competition requirements: original research, independent investigation, practical applications. Looking at my notebooks full of observations and my months of experiments, I realized I might actually have something worth presenting. The application process was daunting. I had to write proposals, get teacher recommendations, and submit preliminary research summaries. I did it all quietly, never mentioning it at home. If I failed, which seemed likely, at least no one would know I'd tried. But as I worked on my new presentation, something shifted inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt competent. More than competent, I felt brilliant. This research was mine, born from my own curiosity and developed through my own persistence. Win or lose, I'd created something meaningful. I just had no idea how meaningful it would prove to be. Keeping my competition preparation secret became an art form. Every day after school, I'd tell Mom I was staying late to work on group projects or help with tutoring, neither technically lies. Since I was working and I was helping myself learn, she seemed relieved that I was finally showing some academic initiative, even if she assumed it was remedial. "At least you're trying," she'd say with a sigh, and I'd nod as if I were indeed struggling to catch up rather than diving deeper into advanced concepts than she could imagine. The empty science classrooms became my sanctuary. Mrs. Patterson, the chemistry teacher, would let me stay after hours as long as I locked up when I left. She never asked many questions about what I was working on. I think she was just happy to see a student. Voluntarily spending extra time with scientific equipment, my research journal, became my most precious possession. It was a thick leather-bound notebook I'd bought with Christmas money, and I filled every page with detailed observations, sketches, hypotheses, and experimental results. I kept it hidden under my mattress at home, bringing it out only when I was sure I wouldn't be interrupted. The secrecy felt necessary. Our family had established patterns, and I was the daughter who struggled academically. If Mom saw me reading advanced microbiology texts or working through environmental chemistry equations, she'd either assume I was in over my head or wonder why this sudden interest couldn't translate to better grades in my regular classes. The truth was, school had become almost irrelevant to my real education. I was learning at a pace and depth that far exceeded my classroom assignments, but I couldn't let my regular grades slip too dramatically, or Mom would restrict my after-school activities. So I maintained my B and C average. Careful not to excel too obviously in science class, my teachers began to notice small changes though. In biology, I'd occasionally ask questions that went beyond the curriculum. In chemistry, I'd suggest alternative approaches to experiments, but I was careful to frame these contributions as curiosity rather than expertise, maintaining my reputation as a steady but unremarkable student. The hardest part was the loneliness. I couldn't share my excitement about discoveries with anyone. When I successfully cultured a new strain of bacteria that showed promise for breaking down plastic pollutants, I had no one to tell. When my water purification research yielded results that could potentially help communities with contaminated water supplies, I celebrated alone in my bedroom. Sometimes I'd catch myself starting to mention something interesting I'd learned, then stopping abruptly when I realized I couldn't explain how I knew it without revealing the depth of my independent research. My family would wonder where a girl who struggled with basic coursework had learned about advanced scientific concepts. I developed elaborate cover stories for my activities. Library visits became study sessions with friends. Trips to collect water samples from different locations became walks in the park. Evenings spent writing up experimental results became working on homework. The lies came easily because they served a greater truth. I was protecting something precious and fragile from the disappointment I'd learned to expect. The competition deadline approached faster than I anticipated. Between my secret research and maintaining my regular academic responsibilities, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I'd never worked so hard on anything in my life, and had never felt so completely absorbed by a project as I put the finishing touches on my presentation boards and practiced my oral presentation in front of my bedroom mirror. I felt a growing sense of confidence that frightened me. What if I was deluding myself? What if my research wasn't as groundbreaking as I believed? What if I was setting myself up for the kind of spectacular failure that would confirm everyone's low expectations? But even as those doubts crept in, I couldn't deny the evidence in front of me. My research was solid. My results were replicable. My conclusions were based on months of careful observation and experimentation. Whatever happened at the competition, I'd done real science, the kind of work that made me feel alive and purposeful. The night before the competition, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too nervous and excited to sleep. Tomorrow I'd finally reveal who I really was, even if only to a panel of judges who didn't know me as the family disappointment. I had no idea I was about to discover that hiding my true abilities was nothing compared to the secrets my family had been keeping from me. I woke up at 5 a.m. on competition day, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. The state science competition was being held at UC Davis, 3 hours away, and I'd registered as an independent participant Since our school's science club had disbanded years ago due to lack of interest, Mom was already up, making coffee in the kitchen when I came downstairs with my project materials, carefully packed in boxes. "You're up early," she said, not looking up from her phone where she was scrolling through Maria's latest Instagram posts from her residency program. "I have that thing today," I said vaguely. I mentioned the competition weeks ago, calling it a regional science fair and downplaying its significance. Mom had nodded absently and promptly forgotten about it. "Oh, right, will you be back for dinner?" "Probably late. It's a long day." She finally looked up, taking in my nervous energy and the boxes of materials. "Do you need a ride?" I've been dreading this question. "No, I'm carpooling with some other kids." I lied smoothly. In reality, I was taking the bus to Davis, then walking to campus, a journey I'd mapped out obsessively over the past week. The bus ride was surreal. I sat clutching my project folder, watching California scenery flash by while trying to calm my racing heart. Other passengers probably saw a typical teenager heading to college for a campus visit. They had no idea I was carrying research that could potentially change how we approach water purification in developing countries. When I arrived at UC Davis, the campus was buzzing with activity. Students and faculty members were setting up registration tables, and I could see other high school competitors arriving with their families. Most had parents carrying equipment, siblings in tow, and the confident air of students who'd been preparing for this with full institutional support. I felt suddenly, acutely alone. The registration process was intimidating. I stood in line behind a girl whose father was explaining fluid dynamics to her in rapid-fire technical language, and a boy whose entire family seemed to be scientists based on their casual discussion of peer review processes. When my turn came, the volunteer looked surprised. "Emma Rodriguez? I don't see a school affiliation listed here." "I'm computing independently," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She raised an eyebrow but handed me my name badge and room assignment. "Independent entries are quite rare. Good luck." Walking through the halls toward the presentation rooms, I passed displays that made my heart sink. These weren't the simple poster boards I was used to seeing at school science fairs. These were professional quality presentations with sophisticated equipment, detailed statistical analysis, and research that clearly involved months of mentorship from teachers and parents with advanced degrees. I found my assigned room and began setting up my display. My presentation boards looked suddenly amateurish compared to the elaborate setups around me. I'd made them myself, printing materials at the library and mounting everything with careful precision, but they looked homemade next to the professional. Displays flanking me, the student to my left had a project on quantum computing that involved equipment I couldn't even identify. The girl to my right was presenting research on genetic markers for early cancer detection, complete with laboratory results from what was clearly a professional medical facility. I started to panic. What was I doing here? These students had resources, mentorship, and institutional support I couldn't even imagine. They'd been groomed for this level of competition while I'd been fumbling around with a garage sale microscope and library book stop, but as I arranged my materials and reviewed my notes, something shifted in my mind. My research might look different from theirs, but it was mine. Every experiment had been designed and conducted by me. Every conclusion had been reached through my own analysis. Every innovative approach had come from my own curiosity and problem solving. I took a deep breath and stepped back to look at my display with fresh eyes. The presentation boards told a clear story. The problem of water contamination in underserved communities. My investigation into biological filtration systems, months of systematic experimentation, and results that showed real promise for scalable, cost-effective solutions. It might not look as polished as the other displays, but the science was solid. The research was original, and the potential applications were genuinely meaningful. As judges began circulating through the room, I straightened my shoulders and prepared to defend work I was finally ready to be proud of. Today, I wasn't the family disappointment or the struggling student. Today, I was a scientist presenting research I believed in. The first judge approached my display, scanning my presentation boards with the same neutral expression she'd worn at every other station. I opened my mouth to begin the presentation. I practiced dozens of times, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely ready to show the world what I was capable of. I just hoped it would be enough. The first judge was Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. She approached my display with the same methodical attention she'd given the other presentations. But something in her expression shifted as she began reading my project summary. Biological water purification using indigenous microorganisms, she read aloud, then looked up at me with genuine interest. This is your independent research? Yes, ma'am. I've been working on it for about 8 months. Walk me through your methodology? I launched into my presentation, and for the first time, all those hours of practice paid off. My nervousness evaporated as I explained my initial observations, the questions that had driven my research, and the systematic approach I'd developed to test my hypotheses. I started by collecting water samples from various sources around my community: ponds, streams, areas with known contamination issues. Under the microscope, I noticed certain microorganisms seemed to thrive in polluted conditions while others died off rapidly. Dr. Chen nodded, following along with my presentation board that showed detailed charts of organism populations in different water samples. That observation led me to investigate whether these hardy microorganisms could actually be breaking down pollutants rather than just surviving in contaminated environments. I designed a series of controlled experiments to test this theory. I showed her my experimental design, something I was particularly proud of. I created multiple test groups with identical water samples, introducing different concentrations of bacteria and measuring pollutant levels over time. It was the kind of rigorous methodology I'd learned from reading actual scientific papers, not from high school textbooks. Your control variables are quite sophisticated, Dr. Chen observed, studying my data tables. How did you account for environmental factors? This was exactly the kind of question I'd hoped for, one that showed she was taking my research seriously enough to examine it critically. I conducted all experiments in controlled temperature and light conditions, using identical containers and water volumes. Each trial was repeated multiple times to ensure statistical significance. I flipped to a page showing my statistical analysis, complete with error bars and confidence intervals. I calculated myself. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. Impressive? And your results? The data shows that specific strains of naturally occurring bacteria can reduce common water pollutants by up to 78% within 72 hours. The most promising applications appear to be for communities that lack access to expensive filtration systems. I pulled out my prototype, a simple biological filtration system I built using materials that would be accessible in developing countries. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. I tested the system with contaminated water samples and consistently achieved purification levels that meet WHO's standards for drinking water safety. Dr. Chen examined the prototype closely, asking detailed questions about maintenance requirements, scalability, and cost-effectiveness. Each question revealed that she was thinking about my research not just as a student project, but as a potentially viable solution to real-world problems. Have you considered submitting this research for publication? She asked finally. The question hit me like a lightning bolt. Publication? I'd been so focused on the competition that I hadn't thought beyond today. I know, I hadn't considered that, I admitted. You should. With some additional data and peer review, this can make a real contribution to the field. She made a note on her evaluation form, then looked up at me with curiosity. What school do you attend? I'd like to speak with your research advisor. Heat flooded my face. I don't have a research advisor. I'm competing independently. Her expression shifted to one of amazement. You conducted all this research on your own? Yes, ma'am. I used library resources, online databases, and equipment I purchased or borrowed. Dr. Chen stared at me for a long moment, then wrote something extensive on her evaluation form. Remarkable, she murmured. Truly remarkable. As she moved on to the next presentation, I felt a surge of confidence unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A real scientist, a professor at a major university, had called my research remarkable. She'd suggested I consider publication. She'd asked detailed technical questions and seemed satisfied with my answers. The next two judges had similar reactions. Both asked probing questions about my methodology and seemed impressed by the thoroughness of my work. One judge, a research scientist from the EPA, spent 20 minutes discussing potential applications for my filtration system in disaster relief scenarios, but it was the final judge who provided the most validation. Dr. James Morrison was a microbiologist who'd published extensively on water treatment systems. He approached my display already familiar with the research area, which made his questions more challenging but also more meaningful. "I've seen similar approaches in laboratory settings," he said after I'd finished my presentation. "But the cost and complexity usually make them impractical for field applications. How did you address those limitations?" I explained my focus on using indigenous microorganisms, bacteria that already existed in local water systems, rather than expensive laboratory-cultured strains. I showed him my cost analysis, which demonstrated that my system could be implemented for under $50 per household. And maintenance requirements? Minimal. The system is designed to be largely self-sustaining, with simple monitoring procedures that don't require technical expertise. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, studying my data with the intensity of someone who understood its implications. "You've identified a genuine problem and developed an elegant solution. The research is sound, the methodology is appropriate, and the applications are significant." As he completed his evaluation, I felt a profound shift in how I saw myself. These weren't judges humoring a high school student's hobby project. They were serious scientists engaging with serious research I had conceived, designed, and executed independently. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to measure up to someone else's standards or apologizing for my limitations. I was presenting work that stood on its own merit, answering questions with confidence born from genuine expertise. Whatever happened next, I'd proven something important to myself. I wasn't just capable of doing real science. I was already doing it. The awards ceremony took place in the university's main auditorium, with hundreds of students, parents, and faculty members filling the seats. I sat near the back, having declined the reserved seating for finalists because I couldn't quite believe I belonged there. They announced awards in reverse order, starting with honorable mentions and working up to the grand prize. Each category brought a mix of relief and growing anticipation as my name wasn't called. With every award that passed, the possibility became more real and more terrifying. Third place in the environmental science category goes to Jennifer Walsh from Marin County High School for her research on microplastics in marine ecosystems. Applause filled the auditorium. I clapped automatically, my palms sweating as I realized there were only 2 spots left. Second place in environmental science goes to David Kim from San Francisco Preparatory Academy for his work on urban air quality monitoring systems. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure people around me could hear it. The presenters paused dramatically before the final announcement. And first place in environmental science, as well as this year's overall grand prize winner, goes to Emma Rodriguez for her groundbreaking research on biological water purification systems using indigenous microorganisms. The words hit me like a physical force. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. Then the applause started and people around me were turning to look, and I realized I needed to stand up. Walking to the stage felt surreal, like moving through a dream. The auditorium lights were bright and warm, and I could see faces in the crowd, some smiling, some curious about the girl they never heard of who just won the state's most prestigious high school science competition. Dr. Chen was presenting the award, and when she placed the trophy in my hands, she leaned close enough to whisper, "I meant what I said about publication. This research deserves a wider audience." The trophy was heavier than I'd expected, solid and real in a way that made everything suddenly concrete. The camera flashes were overwhelming, and I managed to smile and wave despite feeling like I might faint from the combination of shock and joy. Back in my seat, I stared at the trophy, a beautiful crystal structure etched with my name and the competition details. Emma Rodriguez, first place, California State Science Competition. The words seemed impossible, like they belonged to someone else's life. After the ceremony, reporters from local newspapers approached me for interviews. The questions were surreal. How long have you been interested in environmental science? What inspired this research? What are your plans for college? I answered as best I could, still in a state of disbelief. Yes, I'd been interested in science for several years. Yes, I conducted the research independently. Yes, I was planning to pursue environmental engineering in college. Though, until this moment, I'd barely dared to dream that such a path was possible. One reporter asked about my family's reaction to my achievement. They must be so proud of you. I smiled and gave a diplomatic answer about their support, not mentioning that my family had no idea where I was today or what I'd just accomplished. The drive home was a blur of euphoria and nervous energy. I kept glancing at the trophy secured in the passenger seat, afraid it might disappear if I looked away too long. My phone had already started buzzing with calls from reporters and emails from college admissions offices who'd somehow gotten my contact information. The first call was from a scholarship coordinator at UC Berkeley, Dr. Chun's home institution. The second was from Stanford's environmental engineering program. The third was from a local news station wanting to do a feature story dot by the time I reached my hometown. My victory had already been reported online. The local newspaper's website had posted a brief article with my photo from the awards ceremony, and social media notifications were pouring in from classmates and teachers who'd just learned about my achievement. I pulled into our driveways. The sun was setting, trophy in hand, and my phone buzzing incessantly with congratulations from people who'd never paid much attention to me before. The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning, but everything else felt fundamentally different. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at our front door and trying to prepare for whatever reaction awaited me inside. Part of me expected celebration. Surely winning this state science competition was the kind of achievement that would finally earn my family's recognition and pride. But another part of me, the part that had learned to manage expectations over years of disappointment, wondered if even this would be enough. I took a deep breath, gathered my trophy and materials, and walked toward the house where I was about to discover that some victories come with unexpected consequences. The first hint that this homecoming wouldn't go as I'd imagined came when I opened the front door to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper spread in front of her. She looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read, not pride or excitement, but something closer to confusion and suspicion. "Emma," she said slowly, "we need to talk." The newspaper on the kitchen table was folded open to a page with my photo prominently displayed. The headline read, "Local teen wins state science competition with groundbreaking research." Seeing my face staring back from the newsprint made the victory feel real in a way the trophy hadn't quite managed. I had to find out about this from Mrs. Henderson next door. Mom said, her voice tight with something between embarrassment and anger. She called to congratulate me on my daughter's amazing achievement. Imagine my surprise. I set the trophy carefully on the counter where it caught the kitchen light and threw small rainbows on the wall. Mom's eyes flicked to it briefly before returning to my face. "I told you I was going to a science competition today," I said quietly. "You said it was a regional science fair. You made it sound like some small school event, not." She gestured at the newspaper. "This says you beat over 300 students from across the entire state." The accusation in her tone was unmistakable, though I couldn't understand what I was being accused of. Lying? Succeeding? Failing to manage her expectations properly? "I worked really hard on this project, Mom. The research took months." "What? Research?" The question was sharp, cutting. "Emma, you struggle with basic chemistry homework. You brought home a C- on your last biology test. How am I supposed to believe you suddenly developed the expertise to win a state-level competition?" The words hit me like a slap. In all my fantasies about this moment, I never imagined having to defend my victory's legitimacy to my own mother. "You can read about the research right there in the article," I said, pointing to the newspaper. "The judges evaluated my methodology. My data, my conclusions. They asked detailed questions and verified my results. Mom picked up the paper and scanned the article again, her frown deepening. It says here you conducted independent research, using sophisticated experimental design and advanced statistical analysis. Where did you learn any of that? From books, from online resources, from teaching myself because I was interested? Mom's voice rose slightly. Since when are you interested in environmental science? You never mentioned wanting to pursue science as a career. You've never shown any particular aptitude for it. The conversation felt surreal, like being cross-examined for a crime I hadn't committed. I'd expected questions about the competition, about my research, about my future plans. I hadn't expected to have to prove that my own achievements were actually mine. I didn't talk about it because ... I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like accusations. Because science was never something you thought I was good at, that's not true. I've always been supportive of your academic efforts. But even as she said it, we both knew it wasn't really true. Mom had been supportive of Maria's academic efforts. For me, she'd been patient and encouraging in the way people are with children who need extra help, not with children who might excel. Did someone help you with this project? The question came out carefully, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. A teacher? A tutor? Someone from Maria's program? The implications stung more than outright disbelief would have. She couldn't accept that I'd accomplished this independently, so she was searching for an explanation that fit her understanding of my capabilities. No one helped me. I did all the research myself, in my bedroom and after school. I bought my own equipment. I designed my own experiments. Mom stood up and walked over to examine the trophy more closely. She picked it up, reading the engraving as if looking for evidence of fraud. This doesn't make sense. Emma, people don't just suddenly become brilliant at something they've never shown interest in before. Maybe I did show interest. Maybe you just didn't notice. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, and Mom's expression hardened. Don't take that tone with me. I'm trying to understand how my daughter, who needed tutoring to pass sophomore chemistry, suddenly has the expertise to win a state science competition. It's not unreasonable to have questions. My phone buzzed with another congratulatory text, and Mom glanced at it with suspicion. Who's been calling you all afternoon? Reporters, college recruiters, scholarship coordinators. For the first time, her expression showed something other than skepticism. What kind of scholarships? Full rides to UC Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech. They want to discuss my research and potential admission to their environmental engineering programs. Mom sat back down heavily, staring at me as if seeing a stranger. Environmental engineering. Since when do you know anything about environmental engineering? The question revealed something that cut deeper than her disbelief in my abilities. She didn't know me at all. She'd been so focused on my failures and limitations that she'd never bothered to discover my interests, my passions, or my potential. I've been studying it for months, Mom. I've been learning about water treatment systems, environmental chemistry, biological filtration processes. I've been reading research papers and teaching myself advanced concepts because I find them fascinating. You never told me any of this. Would you have believed me if I had? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of low expectations and managed disappointment. Mom looked at the trophy again, then at the newspaper article, then back at me. I just don't understand how this happened, she said finally, and for the first time she sounded more confused than accusatory. It happened because I'm not who you think I am, I said quietly. It happened because I'm capable of more than anyone in this family has ever believed. As if summoned by the tension in the room, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was warm and professional. Emma? This is Dr. Patricia Williams from the National Science Foundation. I've been following your research, and I'd like to discuss some exciting opportunities. I looked at Mom's shocked face as I took the call, and I realized that this conversation, this revelation about who I really was just the beginning. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion from the most intense day of my life. Mom's reaction played on repeat in my mind, not just her disbelief, but the genuine confusion in her voice when she said she didn't understand how this had happened. How could a mother not recognize her own daughter's potential? How could someone who'd raised me for 18 years be so shocked by evidence of my capabilities? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. I started cataloging memories, looking for patterns I never noticed before. When had the low expectations started? Had I always been seen as the struggling daughter, or had something shifted along the way? I got up and pulled out my laptop, creating a document to organize my thoughts. At the top, I wrote, "Why doesn't my family know who I am?" Underneath, I started listing incidents that had bothered me over the years, but that I'd never examined closely. In 5th grade, I'd built an elaborate volcano for the science fair that erupted with perfect timing and detailed explanations of chemical reactions. Mom had seemed surprised by the quality and asked repeatedly if Dad had helped me. He hadn't. In 7th grade, I'd scored in the 95th percentile on the state science assessment. When the results came home, Mom had assumed there was an error and called the school to verify. Last year, when I correctly solved a complex math problem in front of extended family, Uncle Carlos had joked that I must have inherited the smart genes from somewhere unexpected, since they clearly hadn't come from my parents' at the time. I'd laughed along with everyone else, but now the comment felt strange. Why was my intelligence considered unexpected? And what did he mean about not inheriting it from my parents? I opened another browser tab and started searching for our family photos on social media. Mom was active on Facebook, constantly posting pictures and updates about family events. I scrolled back through years of posts, looking at how she described Maria and me in captions. The pattern was stark once I started paying attention. Maria was my brilliant daughter, my little genius, destined for great things. I was my sweet Emma, growing up so fast, finding her way. Even in identical situations, graduation photos, birthday celebrations, academic achievements, the language was completely different, but there was something else that caught my attention as I scrolled through the photos. In pictures from early childhood, Maria and I looked strikingly similar. But as we got older, while Maria continued to resemble both our parents, I developed features that didn't quite fit our family's typical appearance. Maria had Mom's round face and Dad's dark eyes. I had a more angular face structure, lighter eyes that shifted between green and brown, and hair that had natural waves despite both parents having straight hair. I'd always attributed these differences to genetic variation, but looking at family photos with fresh eyes, the contrast seemed more pronounced than I'd realized. I pulled out my high school yearbooks and compared photos of myself to the few pictures I had of Mom and Dad from their high school years. Again, the resemblances seemed less obvious than they should be, feeling slightly ridiculous, but unable to stop myself. I started researching genetics and hereditary traits. What were the chances of two brown-eyed parents having a child with hazel green eyes? What about hair texture and facial structure? The more I read, the more questions I had. Most of the traits that made me different from my family were possible, but statistically unlikely to occur together. Then, I remembered something that had puzzled me for years. When I needed my birth certificate for my driver's license application, Mom had seemed flustered and taken longer than expected to find it. When she finally produced it, she'd insisted on handling all the paperwork herself instead of letting me take it to the DMV at the time. I'd assumed she was just being protective, but now I wondered if there was another reason she hadn't wanted me examining the document closely. I crept downstairs to the home office where Mom kept important documents. I knew exactly where she stored our birth certificates and a fireproof safe with our passports and other vital records. I'd seen her access it dozens of times over the years. The safe was locked, of course, but I knew the combination. It was Dad's birthday, the same code Mom used for everything despite Dad's regular complaints about security. Inside, I found Maria's birth certificate immediately. It was crisp and clear, with both parents' names listed in neat handwriting, hospital information, and an official seal. My birth certificate was different. The paper was older, more yellowed, and when I looked closely, there seemed to be inconsistencies in the handwriting. The hospital name was one I didn't recognize, despite the fact that Maria and I had supposedly been born at the same facility. Most troubling was a faint line across the document that suggested it had been folded and refolded many times, unlike Maria's pristine certificate. And there was something odd about the father's name. The handwriting looked different from the rest of the document, as if it had been added later. I photographed both documents with my phone, then carefully returned them to the safe. Back in my room, I zoomed in on the images, comparing every detail. The more I studied my birth certificate, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right. The paper quality was different. The ink color varied slightly between sections. The hospital listed was 40 miles away from where we lived, while Maria had been born at the local medical center just 10 minutes from our house. I spent the rest of the night researching the hospital listed on my birth certificate. It was a small facility that had closed permanently 5 years ago due to financial difficulties. Their records had been transferred to the county health department, but access required proof of identity and a formal request process. As dawn broke, I sat surrounded by printed articles, family photos, and pages of notes I'd made throughout the night. I had more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. There were secrets in my family that went far deeper than anyone's surprise about my academic abilities. The science competition victory had revealed something unexpected, not just my hidden talents, but the possibility that my entire understanding of my family history might be wrong, and I was determined to find out the truth. The next morning, I went through my old school records with new eyes. Mom had kept everything in meticulously organized folders: report cards, achievement certificates, teacher comments, standardized test scores. I never bothered to look through them before, assuming they'd just confirm what I already knew about my academic struggles. But as I spread the documents across my bedroom floor, a different picture emerged. My elementary school report cards told a story I didn't remember. In kindergarten, my teacher had written, "Emma shows exceptional curiosity about the natural world and asks sophisticated questions during science activities." First grade, Emma's reading comprehension is remarkably advanced for her age group. Second grade, Emma demonstrates logical thinking skills that exceed grade level expectations. How had I forgotten this? How had my family forgotten this? I found my third grade science fair certificate first place for a project on plant growth under different light conditions. The accompanying photo showed me grinning proudly next to an elaborate display with charts, graphs, and detailed observations. I looked confident, excited, completely absorbed in explaining my findings. But I also found something else in that photo that made my breath catch. Standing behind me was a man I didn't recognize, tall, with light brown hair and the same hazel green eyes I saw in the mirror every day. He was holding a ribbon and smiling at me with obvious pride. I'd never seen this man before in my life, yet he was clearly part of my science fair victory. I dug deeper into the box of school memorabilia, looking for other photos from that period. What I found were gaps, missing pictures from events where I'd apparently done well, while photos of Maria's achievements were carefully preserved and displayed. In fourth grade, my standardized test scores had placed me in the 98th percentile for both math and science reasoning. A note from my teacher recommended me for the gifted and talented program, but I had no memory of being enrolled in any advanced classes. I found a letter from the school district dated when I was in 5th grade, addressed to my parents. It recommended psychological testing to determine if I might benefit from accelerated placement in mathematics and science. The letter was creased and worn as if it had been read many times, but I'd never heard anything about psychological testing or advanced placement. The most puzzling discovery was a folder labeled Emma Special Services that contained documents I'd never seen before. There were meeting notes from conferences between my parents and school administrators, discussion of my irregular academic performance, and inconsistent engagement with classroom materials. One note, dated from my 6th grade year, contained a comment that stopped me cold. Parents report concerns about Emma's increasing questions about family history and her tendency to dig too deeply into subjects that capture her interest. Recommend counseling to help Emma focus on age-appropriate academic goals. I'd been sent to counseling? I had no memory of this, but the documentation was clear. I'd apparently met with the school psychologist weekly for an entire semester. The final report noted that I was intellectually gifted, but emotionally troubled by questions about identity and family belonging. Questions about identity and family belonging. In 6th grade, what had I known then that I couldn't remember now? What questions had I been asking that concerned my parents enough to seek professional intervention? I kept searching through the documents, looking for clues about what had shifted my trajectory from gifted student to family disappointment. The pattern became clear around 7th grade. My grades had dropped significantly. My teacher comments changed from praise to concern, and my achievement test scores had fallen from exceptional to average, but the most revealing document was a handwritten note I'd apparently written to myself and hidden in my 8th grade science textbook. In my own adolescent handwriting, it said, "They don't want me to be smart. It makes them uncomfortable. Maybe if I stop trying so hard, they'll love me more." The note was devastating to read, but it explained everything. At some point, I'd learned that my intelligence was threatening to my family's equilibrium. I'd consciously chosen to diminish myself in hopes of gaining acceptance, and it had worked in a sense. The lower my achievements, the more comfortable my family became with me. When I stopped asking probing questions and started struggling with basic concepts, the tension at home decreased. When I gave up on advanced placement and settled for average grades, everyone seemed relieved. I traded my potential for peace, and over time, I convinced myself that this diminished version of me was who I really was. But the science competition had shattered that carefully constructed identity. When I'd allowed myself to pursue genuine intellectual curiosity again, my natural abilities had reasserted themselves with a vengeance. The question that haunted me as I sat surrounded by evidence of my forgotten brilliance was why my family had been so threatened by my intelligence in the first place. Why had my success made them uncomfortable? Why had my questions about family history been concerning enough to warrant counseling? I thought about the man in the science fair photo, the one with my eyes who looked at me with such pride. I thought about my birth certificate discrepancies, my physical differences from my parents, and Uncle Carlos's joke about inheriting intelligence from somewhere unexpected. Pieces of a puzzle were starting to form, but I couldn't quite see the complete picture yet. What I could see was that my family's surprise about my science. Competition victory wasn't really about sudden academic improvement. It was about the return of abilities they'd worked very hard to suppress. The question was, why they'd felt the need to suppress them in the first place, and what truth they'd been trying to hide. 3 days after my competition victory, Mom left for her monthly business trip to Los Angeles. She'd been increasingly uncomfortable around me since the newspaper article, avoiding conversations about my future plans and changing the subject. Whenever someone mentioned my research, Dad was working late, as usual, which left me alone in the house with questions that were consuming every waking moment. I'd been thinking about the man in my 3rd grade science fair photo, trying to place him in my memories. The more I studied his face, the more familiar he seemed, yet I couldn't identify him as any family friend, teacher, or relative I remembered. That's when I decided to search Mom's bedroom. I felt guilty about invading her privacy, but the alternative was living with questions that were eating me alive. I started with her dresser drawers. Looking for photo albums or documents, I might have missed Dot in the bottom drawer. Underneath layers of sweaters she never wore, I found a manila envelope that made my heart race. It was labeled Emma Medical in Mom's handwriting, but it wasn't with our other medical records in the office filing cabinet. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Prenatal care records from a doctor I didn't recognize. Hospital paperwork from my birth, and several letters addressed to Mom during her pregnancy. But it was the ultrasound photo that stopped me cold. The image was clearly labeled with Mom's name and a date that corresponded to when she would have been pregnant with me. But handwritten in the margin was a note that made no sense. Patient requests complete confidentiality regarding paternity. All communications to be directed through Dr. Harrison only. Dr. Harrison, I pulled out my phone and searched for the name, adding obstetrician and our city to the search terms. What I found was an obituary from 3 years ago for Dr. Margaret Harrison, who had specialized in discreet prenatal care for patients requiring privacy and confidentiality. The language was strange, almost coded. Why would someone need discreet prenatal care? Why would paternity require confidentiality? I kept digging through the envelope and found a letter that answered my questions in the most shocking way possible. It was addressed to Mom, dated 6 months before my birth, written on letterhead from the university where she'd been working as a research assistant. The letter was from a Professor David Chun, the same last name as Dr. Sarah Chun, the judge who'd been so impressed with my research. "Dear Elena," the letter began, "I understand your decision to end our relationship, and I respect your choice to raise the baby with your husband. However, I want you to know that I'm prepared to provide financial support, and that I hope someday you'll allow me to be part of the child's life. The baby deserves to know their true heritage and capabilities." My hands were shaking as I read the rest of the letter. Professor Chun wrote about his research in environmental science, his published papers on water treatment systems, and his hope that our child might inherit his passion for scientific discovery. Our child. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't Dad's biological daughter. I was the result of an affair between Mom and her supervising professor, a scientist whose research area perfectly matched the interests I developed independently. Suddenly, everything made sense. The physical differences, the intelligence that seemed to come from nowhere, Mom's discomfort with my scientific abilities, the counseling to help me stop asking questions about family history. Mom hadn't been surprised by my sudden academic achievement. She'd been terrified by it. I kept searching through the papers with trembling fingers, finding more letters from Professor Chun over the years. He'd continued to reach out, requesting updates about my development, offering financial support, expressing hope for eventual contact. In one letter, dated when I was in elementary school, he wrote, "I saw the article in the local paper about Emma's science fair victory. The project sounds remarkably sophisticated for a child her age. I recognized my own curiosity and analytical thinking in her work. Please consider allowing me to mentor her scientific interests." Mom's response was paper-clipped to his letter, a brief, cold note explaining that Emma was thriving in her current environment and that outside interference would only confuse and hurt the child, but Professor Chun hadn't given up entirely. I found evidence that he'd been quietly following my academic progress through public records and school publications. He'd even attended my high school graduation, sitting in the back section reserved for community members rather than family. The final letter in the collection was dated just 2 years ago. "Elena, I know you've asked me to stop writing, but I couldn't let Emma's 18th birthday pass without reaching out. She's legally an adult now, old enough to make her own decisions about contact. I've enclosed information about myself and my family medical history, in case she ever wants to know where half her genetic heritage comes from. I've also included a scholarship application for my university's environmental science program, not because I want to interfere, but because denying Emma opportunities that match her natural abilities seems cruel to both of us." I stared at the letter, my mind racing. Professor Chun had been offering me scholarship opportunities, and Mom had never told me. He'd been trying to connect with me my entire life, and I'd never known he existed. But there was more in the envelope recent newspaper, clippings about my science competition victory, printed from online sources with a handwritten note attached. "Congratulations, Emma. I always knew you had the potential for groundbreaking research. I hope someday we can discuss your work together. Your father, David Chun." My father. Not the man who'd raised me, but the man who'd contributed half my DNA and all of my scientific curiosity. The man whose colleague, Dr. Sarah Chun, had evaluated my research just days ago and suggested I consider publication. I sat on Mom's bedroom floor, surrounded by 18 years of hidden correspondence, finally understanding why my family had been so shocked by my achievements. They'd spent my entire life trying to suppress evidence of David Chun's influence, hoping I'd never develop the intellectual capabilities that would reveal the truth about my parentage, but genetics had won out. despite their efforts to diminish. My potential, my biological father's gifts had manifested anyway. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and whether I had the courage to contact the father I'd never known I had. I waited until Dad came home from work that evening, the letters and documents spread across my desk like evidence in a trial. My hands hadn't stopped shaking since I'd made the discovery, and I've rehearsed this conversation dozens of times in my head, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of confronting the man who had raised me with the truth about my parentage. Dad looked exhausted as he loosened his tie and headed toward the kitchen. I intercepted him in the hallway. "Dad, we need to talk." Something in my voice must have warned him, because his expression immediately shifted from tired to wary. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I led him to the living room and sat across from him, the manila envelope in my lap. For a moment, we just looked at each other, this man who'd been at every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every milestone of my life, and me, his daughter who wasn't actually his daughter. "I found some papers in Mom's room," I said finally. "Papers about my birth, about Professor David Chun." Dad's face went completely white. He leaned back in his chair as if I'd physically pushed him, and I saw 8 years of carefully maintained secrets crumble in his expression. "Oh, Emma," he whispered, "how much do you know?" "I know David Chun is my biological father. I know Mom had an affair with him when she was working as his research assistant. I know you've both been hiding this from me my entire life." Dad buried his face in his hands, and when he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears I'd never seen before. "I never wanted you to find out this way. We always planned to tell you eventually, when you were old enough to understand." "I'm 18, Dad. How much older did I need to be?" He flinched at the anger in my voice, but I couldn't help it. 8 years of lies, of suppressed potential, of feeling like an outsider in my own family, and they thought I wasn't ready for the truth. "It's complicated, Emma. Your mother and we were going through a rough patch when she started working with Professor Chun. I was traveling constantly for work, and she felt isolated, overwhelmed with Maria. So she had an affair." "Yes." The word came out like a confession at church, heavy with guilt and regret. "But when she found out she was pregnant, she ended things with him immediately. She chose our family." "She chose me. What about what I might have chosen? What about my right to know my own father?" Dad's composure finally cracked. "He's not your father." The words came out louder than he'd intended, filled with pain and defensiveness. "I'm your father. I was there for your first steps, your first words, your first day of school. I taught you to ride a bike and helped with homework and worried about you every single day. Biology doesn't make someone a father, love does." The anguish in his voice broke my heart, but it didn't erase the lies. "I know you love me, Dad. I know you've been an amazing father. But that doesn't change the fact that you've been hiding part of who I am. We were protecting you." "From what?" "From knowing I'm intelligent? From understanding why I'm passionate about science? From having a relationship with someone who could have mentored my interests instead of discouraging them?" Dad stared at me, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was saying. "You knew about my abilities, didn't you?" "You knew I was capable of more than I was achieving." He nodded slowly. "When you were little, you reminded us so much of him. The questions you asked, the way you approached problems, your natural curiosity about how things worked. It was like watching David all over again. So you discouraged it." "We were terrified," he admitted. "Every time you showed signs of his intelligence, every time you excelled at something that matched his expertise, we worried you'd start asking questions we weren't ready to answer. Like what happened in 6th grade, when I was sent to counseling for asking too many questions about family history." Dad's shock was genuine. "How do you know about that?" "I found my old school records. I found documentation of meetings between you and school, administrators about my irregular academic performance. I found a note I wrote to myself about stopping trying so hard so that you'd love me more." The words hit him like physical blows. He doubled over, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "We never wanted you to feel unloved," he said through his tears. We thought we were protecting our family. We thought if we could just help you fit in, be normal, be happy with a regular life. You thought if you could make me ordinary, I'd never discover the truth. Yes, he whispered. And we were wrong. God, Emma, we were so wrong. I pulled out one of Professor Chun's letters and handed it to him. He's been trying to contact me for years. He offered scholarships, mentorship, opportunities you never told me about. Dad read the letter with shaking hands, his face cycling through guilt, pain, and something that looked like fear. What were you afraid would happen if I knew him? That you'd choose him over us. That you'd realize your real family was the one that shared your intellectual gifts, not the one that loved you but couldn't understand you. The vulnerability in his admission made my anger soften slightly. This wasn't just about deception, it was about a man's terror of losing the daughter he'd raised as his own. Did you think I'd stop loving you if I knew the truth? I didn't know. I couldn't take that risk. You were my daughter in every way that mattered to me. I couldn't bear the thought of you discovering you belonged somewhere else. But I never belonged here, did I? Not really. You spent my entire childhood trying to make me into someone I wasn't, discouraging the very traits that make me who I am. Dad wiped his eyes and looked at me with an expression of profound regret. You're right. We handled this terribly. We let our fear override your needs, your rights, your potential. We convinced ourselves we were protecting you, but we were really protecting ourselves. From what? From losing you. From having our family torn apart by a mistake your mother made 18 years ago. From having to admit that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the damage we do to the people we're trying to protect. I sat back, processing his words. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with sadness for all of us, for the childhood I'd spent feeling inadequate, for the father who'd spent 18 years terrified of losing me, for the mother who buried her guilt so deep it had poisoned her relationship with her own daughter. I need to meet him, I said finally. Dad nodded, though it clearly cost him everything to agree. I know you do. I need to understand where I come from, what I inherited from him, why science feels so natural to me. And after you meet him, what happens to us? The question was quiet, vulnerable, the plea of a man who'd already lost one family and couldn't bear to lose another. You're still my dad, I said, and I meant it. You raised me, loved me, supported me even when you didn't understand me. That doesn't change because I want to know my biological father too. But things will be different. Yes, they will. Because I can't pretend anymore that I'm someone I'm not. I can't diminish myself to make other people comfortable. The science competition proved that when I'm allowed to be my authentic self, I'm capable of extraordinary things. Dad nodded slowly, accepting what we both knew was inevitable. Your mother is going to be devastated when she finds out, then maybe it's time she stopped running from the consequences of her choices. She loves you, Emma. She's made terrible decisions, but everything she's done has been motivated by love and fear. I know that. But love without honesty isn't really love, it's just control disguised as protection. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us adjusting to this new reality where secrets have been replaced by painful truths. Will you help me contact him? I asked finally. Dad's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Then he nodded. If that's what you want, yes. I'll help you reach out to Professor Chen. Thank you. Just promise me one thing. What? Promise me you'll remember that genetics might determine your capabilities, but the family that raised you shaped your character. David Chen may be your biological father, but you're the person you are because of 18 years of being loved by people who tried their best, even when their best wasn't good enough. I looked at this man who'd attended every school event, celebrated every small victory, and comforted every disappointment, and I felt a surge of love that had nothing to do with DNA. I promise, Dad, and I promise that learning about my biological father won't change how much I love the one who raised me. But even as I said the words, I knew that calling Professor Chen would change everything for all of us. I spent that night researching Professor David Chen, diving into his academic background with the same methodical approach I'd used for my water purification project. What I discovered was both thrilling and overwhelming. I wasn't just the daughter of any scientist, but of a renowned researcher whose work had shaped environmental policy across 3 decades. His university biography revealed an impressive career: PhD in environmental engineering from MIT, postdoctoral research at Stanford, over 200 published papers, and leadership roles in major environmental organizations. But it was his specific research focus that took my breath away. Professor Chen had spent his career developing biological water treatment systems for underserved communities. His groundbreaking work on using indigenous microorganisms for water purification had influenced policy in dozens of developing countries and earned him international recognition. I was staring at research that was essentially an advanced version of my own competition project. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Not only had I independently developed an interest in his exact field of expertise, but I'd approached the problem using similar methodologies and reached comparable conclusions. The apple hadn't just fallen close to the tree, it had landed in the exact same grove. I found videos of his lectures online and watched them with growing amazement. His mannerisms, his way of explaining complex concepts, even his hand gestures as he spoke, I recognized all of it. These are behaviors I'd never seen before. Yet they felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. In one lecture from 5 years ago, he discussed the ethical implications of environmental research, emphasizing the responsibility scientists have to make their work accessible to communities that need it most. His passion for the subject was evident, and I understood suddenly where my own drive to solve real-world problems had originated. But the most revealing discovery came when I found his recent research papers. In several publications from the past 3 years, he'd acknowledged funding from something called the Rodriguez Environmental Education Fund. When I searched for more information about this fund, I discovered it provided scholarships specifically for first-generation college students pursuing environmental science degrees. The fund had been established 18 years ago the year I was born. Professor Chen had created a scholarship program for students like me, funding their education in environmental science while being denied the opportunity to fund his own daughter's development in the same field. I found the contact information for his university office and stared at his phone number for an hour. Before finally gathering the courage to dial, the phone rang twice before a warm professional voice answered. Professor Chen's office. This is David speaking. Professor Chen. This is ... I paused, my heart racing. This is Emma Rodriguez. The silence that followed felt eternal. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Emma, my God, Emma, is it really you? Yes, sir. I found your letters. I know about ... everything. Are you all right? How are you feeling about all this? The genuine concern in his voice nearly undid me. Here was a man I'd never met asking about my emotional well-being with the kind of care I'd always wished for from my family when discussing my achievements. I'm confused, but I'm okay. I have a lot of questions. Of course you do. I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be. Would you like to meet? Only if you're comfortable with that, of course. I don't want to pressure you. I'd like that very much. We arranged to meet the following weekend at a coffee shop near his university campus. As we talked, I learned more about his life. He'd never married, never had other children, and had channeled his paternal instincts into mentoring graduate students and funding educational opportunities for young scientists. I saw the news coverage of your science competition victory, he said before we hung up. I hope you know how proud I am. Your research on biological water purification is exactly the kind of innovative thinking our field needs. You've read about my research? I've done more than read about it. I've reviewed your methodology and results through contacts at the competition. Emma, what you accomplished independently, with no formal training or equipment, is remarkable. You have an intuitive understanding of environmental systems that typically takes years of graduate study to develop. For the first time in my life, someone was discussing my intellectual capabilities with unqualified enthusiasm rather than surprise or suspicion. I've been passionate about environmental science for years, but I never understood why it came so naturally to me. It's in your DNA, quite literally. But more than that, you have the kind of analytical mind and ethical drive that makes for truly impactful research. Have you considered what you want to study in college? Environmental engineering, but I haven't been sure it was realistic for someone like me. Someone like you? Emma, you just won a state science competition with research that could be published in peer-reviewed journals. You're exactly the kind of person who should be pursuing environmental engineering. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I felt like I discovered not just a biological father, but a mentor who understood my intellectual passions in ways my family never had. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, processing the reality that I had a parent who was excited by my achievements rather than threatened by them. Someone who saw my potential as something to be nurtured rather than suppressed. But I also felt a profound sadness for all the lost years, the mentorship I could have received, the encouragement that might have prevented my period of academic self-sabotage, the sense of belonging I'd been searching for my entire life. Professor Chun had been ready to be part of my life from the beginning. He tried to maintain contact, offered opportunities, and celebrated my achievements from afar. My family had decided I was better off without him, but their decision had ultimately hurt everyone involved. The meeting I'd arranged would be the first step toward reclaiming the part of my identity I'd never known existed. But I also knew it would force my family to confront the consequences of choices they'd made 8 years ago, choices that had shaped every aspect of my life without my knowledge or consent. As I prepared for bed, I looked at my science competition, trophies sitting on my desk, gleaming in the lamplight. It had started as a symbol of personal achievement, but now I understood it represented something much larger, the emergence of a heritage I'd been denied and the beginning of a relationship I'd never known I was missing. I called Maria that evening, knowing I couldn't face our family's reckoning without first understanding what my sister had known. And when she'd known it, she was between shifts at the hospital, exhausted but alert in the way medical residents learn to manage. Emma, I saw the news about your competition. That's incredible, seriously. I had no idea you were interested in environmental science. That's what I'm calling about, actually. There's something we need to discuss, and I think you might know more than you've let on. The pause that followed was telling. When Maria spoke, again, her voice was more cautious. What do you mean? I found out about David Chen. I know he's my biological father. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Maria finally responded, her voice was barely a whisper. Oh, Emma, how did you find out? So you knew. Yes, I've known for years. The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. Not only had my parents hidden this from me, but my sister, the person I confided in about feeling like an outsider in our family, had known the reason all along. Since when? I overheard Mom and Dad arguing about it when I was 15 and you were 12. They were discussing whether to tell you, and Mom was adamant that you could never know. Dad wanted to be honest, but Mom convinced him it would destroy our family. And he never thought to tell me, even when I spent years feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. Emma, I was 15. I didn't understand the implications, and I was terrified of breaking up our family. By the time I was old enough to realize how wrong it was to keep this from you, it felt too late to bring it up. Too late? Maria, I just spent 8 years thinking I was intellectually inferior to everyone in our family. I convinced myself I was the disappointing daughter who couldn't measure up. You could have saved me from that. I know. Her voice cracked. God, Emma, I know, and I'm so sorry. But you have to understand, Mom made it clear that this secret could destroy everything. She said if you ever found out, you'd choose David over us, and our family would fall apart. So instead, you all chose to let me fall apart. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. While they'd been protecting their version of family unity, I'd been struggling with an identity crisis none of them had bothered to help me understand. There's more you need to know, Maria said quietly. More. About why I succeeded academically while you struggled. It wasn't just natural ability, Emma. I had advantages you didn't. What kind of advantages? Mom and Dad got me tutoring from the time I was in elementary school, private test prep, advanced classes, college counseling. They invested heavily in my education because they wanted to prove that their real daughter could be just as successful as David's. The revelation was like a punch to the stomach. They sabotaged my education to prove a point. Not sabotaged exactly, but they definitely didn't give you the same opportunities. And when you started showing signs of being naturally gifted, they panicked. That's why I was sent to counseling in 6th grade. Yes, you were asking too many questions about why you looked different, why you were interested in things nobody else in our family cared about. The school psychologist told them you were showing signs of feeling displaced in your family structure. Because I was displaced. Because you were brilliant and they were too scared to acknowledge it. Emma, you have to understand, every time you excelled at something, especially anything science-related, it reminded them of David. They weren't trying to hurt you. They were trying to protect themselves from the constant reminder of Mom's affair. At my expense. At your expense. She agreed. And I participated in it. When you'd get excited about a science project or ask complex questions, I'd redirect the conversation or suggest you focus on other subjects. I convinced myself I was helping you fit in better. I remembered those moments the way Maria would, smile indulgently when I showed her my research, then change the subject to something more age-appropriate. I'd interpreted her behavior as disinterest, but now I understood it had been calculated discouragement. Did you ever feel guilty about it? Every day. Especially as we got older and I could see how much you were struggling with your sense of identity. You'd make comments about feeling stupid or wondering why you couldn't be more like me, and I knew the truth could have helped you understand yourself better. But you chose the family secret over my well-being. I chose what I thought was family stability over individual truth. I was wrong, but I was also young and scared. Mom made it seem like telling you would be the most selfish thing I could do. And now I think keeping it from you was the most selfish thing we all did. I appreciated her honesty, but it didn't erase the years of feeling inadequate or the opportunities I'd missed because my own family had conspired to diminish my potential. I'm meeting David this weekend. I think you should. Emma, there's something else you should know about him. He's been following your achievements your whole life. Every school article about your science projects, every academic recognition, every small victory, he's kept track of all of it. How do you know that? Because 3 years ago, when I was doing research for a medical school project, I came across his work and realized we shared a last name. I reached out to him, thinking he might be a distant relative or something. You've been in contact with him? Just a few emails, but yes. He's never stopped hoping for a relationship with you. He's never stopped believing in your potential. And Emma, when he talks about you, the pride in his voice is unmistakable. The conversation left me with mixed emotions, anger at the deception, sadness for the lost time, but also a growing sense of anticipation about finally meeting the person who might help me understand where I truly belonged. Are you going to tell Mom and Dad that I know? I think they already suspect. Dad's been unusually quiet since your competition victory, and Mom's been avoiding discussing your future plans. They're scared. They're terrified. But Emma, maybe it's time for all of us to stop letting fear dictate our choices. After we hung up, I sat with the realization that my entire family had been living a lie for 8 years, not just my parents, but Maria too. They'd all prioritized their version of family harmony over my right to know my own identity. But now the truth was out, and there was no going back to the carefully constructed fiction we'd all been living with. The only question was whether we could build something honest and authentic from the wreckage of all those years of deception. Mom came home from her business trip on Friday evening, and I could tell immediately that Dad had warned her. She moved through the house with the careful precision of someone bracing for impact, avoiding eye contact and focusing intently on unpacking her suitcase. I let her settle in, gave her time to have dinner, and waited until we were alone in the living room before I placed the manila envelope on the coffee table between us. We need to talk about David Chun. Mom's face went ashen. She stared at the envelope as if it contained explosives, which in a way it did. Emma, I can explain. I don't want explanations. I want the truth. All of it. From the beginning. She sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than her 46 years. When she finally met my eyes, hers were filled with tears she was trying not to shed. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen. You had an affair with your research supervisor, got pregnant, and then spent 18 years hiding my paternity from me. It wasn't that simple. Then make it simple for me? Mom took a shaky breath and began the story I'd been waiting my entire life to hear. Your father and I were going through a terrible time. He was traveling constantly for work, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. Maria was a difficult toddler, and I felt completely isolated and overwhelmed. When I got the research assistant position with David, it felt like a lifeline intellectual stimulation, adult conversation, a sense of purpose beyond changing diapers and managing tantrums. So you fell for him. I didn't plan to. David was brilliant, passionate about his work, and he treated me like an intellectual equal in ways your father never had. We started spending long hours together, working on research projects, discussing ideas. It felt like the first time in years that someone saw me as more than just a wife and mother. And Dad didn't notice? Dad was dealing with his own career pressures. His company was restructuring and he was fighting to keep his position. When he was home, he was distracted and exhausted. I convinced myself that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. Until he got pregnant, Mom nodded, wiping away tears. I knew immediately that the baby might not be his. The timing made it obvious. I was terrified, devastated, completely lost about what to do. Did you consider telling Dad the truth? Every day. But David wanted me to leave your father, wanted us to build a life together. He was talking about marriage, about raising the baby as a family. And your father was finally getting his career stabilized. Destroying his marriage would have ruined everything he'd worked for. So you chose Dad. I chose the life I'd already built. I ended things with David, told him I was staying with my family, and decided to raise the baby, you as your father's daughter. And David just accepted that? No. Mom's voice broke. He fought for us. He wrote letters, made calls, begged me to reconsider. He said he wanted to be part of the baby's life, even if I wouldn't be part of his. But I was terrified that any contact between you and David would eventually reveal the truth, and I couldn't risk losing your father. So you cut David out completely. I had to. Every time he tried to reach out, it reminded me of the mistake I'd made and the lies I was building our family on. I convinced myself that you were better off not knowing him, that our stable family was more important than his biological connection. But I wasn't better off. I spent my entire childhood feeling like an outsider in my own family. I know that now. God, Emma, I know that now. But at the time, I thought I was protecting everyone you, your father, even David. I thought if I could just keep the secret buried deep enough, it would eventually stop mattering. It never stopped mattering. It shaped every interaction we've ever had. Mom looked at me with anguish. What do you mean? Every time I showed academic promise, you discouraged it. Every time I got excited about science, you redirected my attention elsewhere. You couldn't celebrate my achievements because they reminded you of him. That's not true. It is true, and we both know it. You sent me to counseling when I started asking questions about family history. You denied me the educational support you gave Maria. You convinced me I was intellectually inferior when the truth is that I inherited David's analytical abilities, and you were terrified I'd discover that connection. Mom crumbled, finally allowing herself to cry openly. I was so scared, Emma. Every day, I was terrified that you'd realize you didn't belong with us, that you'd want to find your real father and leave us behind. David is my biological father, but Dad is my real father too. You never gave me the chance to prove that I could love both of them without betraying either one. I was protecting our family. You were protecting yourself. You were so consumed with guilt about your affair that you sacrificed my right to know my own identity to avoid facing the consequences of your choices. The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. For 8 years, Mom's shame had dictated my reality, and I paid the price for her inability to deal honestly with her mistakes. What happens now? she asked quietly. Now I'm going to meet David. I'm going to learn about the part of myself you've kept hidden from me. I'm going to explore the intellectual heritage you've spent my entire life trying to suppress. And us? What happens to our family? That depends on whether you can accept me as I really am instead of trying to reshape me into someone who makes you more comfortable. Mom looked at the envelope still sitting between us. What's in there? 18 years of letters from David. Scholarship offers, mentorship opportunities, expressions of love and pride in my achievements, all the support you denied me because you were afraid of the truth. She reached for the envelope with trembling hands, then stopped. Do you hate me? The question hung in the air, and I considered it carefully. Did I hate her? I was angry, hurt, disappointed, and frustrated by years of deception. But hate felt too simple for the complex mix of emotions I was experiencing. I don't hate you, Mom, but I don't trust you anymore. And I can't pretend that the choices you made didn't damage our relationship in ways that might be permanent. Can we fix this? Can we rebuild what we've lost? I don't know. That depends on whether you're willing to accept that you were wrong, that your decisions hurt me, and that going forward, you need to support my relationship with David instead of sabotaging it. Mom nodded slowly. I'll try. Emma, I'll try to do better. Trying isn't enough anymore. Either you accept all of who I am, including the parts I inherited from David, or we don't have a future relationship. The ultimatum was clear, and we both understood its implications. After 18 years of living with her guilt and fear, Mom would finally have to choose between honest acceptance and continued deception. As I gathered the letters and headed to my room, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth was finally out, but the family I'd known was forever changed. Tomorrow, I would meet my biological father and begin to understand the missing pieces of my identity. But tonight, I grieved for the relationships that had been damaged by years of well-intentioned lies and the time we can never get back. Meeting David Chun for the first time was surreal, like looking into a mirror that reflected not just my physical features, but my intellectual curiosity and passion for discovery. We sat in a quiet corner of the coffee shop near his university, two strangers who shared DNA and, as it turned out, remarkably similar approaches to understanding the world. He was taller than I'd expected, with graying hair and the same hazel green eyes I saw in my reflection every morning. But it was his mannerisms that struck me most, the way he gestured when explaining complex ideas, his habit of pausing to consider questions carefully before answering, and the genuine excitement in his voice when discussing scientific concepts. You look so much like your mother did at your age, he said softly, studying my face with wonder. But you have my stubborn chin and my terrible habit of overthinking everything. We spent 4 hours together that first meeting, and I learned more about myself in that conversation than I had in 18 years of family interactions. David understood my need to dig deeper into subjects that captured my interest. He appreciated my tendency to question conventional approaches to problems. He celebrated the intellectual restlessness that my family had always seen as problematic. Your research methodology for the competition was remarkably sophisticated, he said, reviewing the materials I brought. The way you approach the problem, the controls you established, the statistical analysis, you're thinking like a graduate student, not a high school senior. Is that unusual? It's extraordinary. Emma, most students don't develop that level of analytical thinking until they've had years of formal training. You've done it intuitively. For the first time in my life, someone was discussing my intellectual abilities as gifts to be nurtured rather than problems to be managed. But our conversation wasn't just about science. David shared stories about his own childhood, his journey through academia, and the research that had shaped his career. I saw myself reflected in his experiences, the early fascination with how things worked, the drive to solve real-world problems, the satisfaction of discovering something new. I've thought about you every day for 8 years, he told me as our meeting drew to a close. I've wondered what kind of person you were becoming, whether you were happy, whether you'd inherited any of my interests. Seeing you now, knowing what you've accomplished independently, I couldn't be more proud. The pride in his voice was uncomplicated, unconditional, based purely on who I was, rather than who he needed me to be for his own emotional comfort. We arranged to meet regularly, and over the following weeks I began to understand what I'd been missing all my life. David didn't just accept my intellectual intensity, he encouraged it, challenged it, and helped me channel it more effectively. But integrating this new relationship into my existing family dynamics proved complicated. Dad struggled with jealousy and insecurity, worried that David's mentorship would diminish my love for the man who'd raised me. I had to repeatedly reassure him that having two father figures didn't mean choosing between them. David can teach me about environmental science and research methodology, I told Dad one evening. But you taught me about integrity, persistence, and unconditional love. I need both of those influences in my life. Mom's adjustment was even more difficult. Every mention of David triggered visible anxiety, and she seemed to interpret my excitement about our developing relationship as criticism of her parenting choices. I understand that you're building a relationship with him, she said during one particularly tense dinner conversation, but I hope you remember everything our family has given you over the years. I do remember, Mom, but I also remember 18 years of feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere. David helps me understand why I felt that way, and that understanding doesn't diminish my appreciation for the family that raised me. The most challenging aspect was establishing boundaries that honored both my relationships and my own needs. I had to make it clear to my family that my connection with David wasn't negotiable. He was part of my life now, and I needed to accept that reality. At the same time, I had to help David understand that while I treasured our newfound relationship, I wouldn't use it as a weapon against the family who raised me, despite their mistakes. They made decisions based on fear and guilt, I explained to him. Those decisions hurt me, but they weren't malicious. They were just terribly misguided. I'm proud of your maturity in handling this, David said. It would be easy to punish them for keeping us apart, but that wouldn't serve anyone's best interests. Scholarship letters that had been arriving steadily since my competition victory helped demonstrate that my future didn't depend on choosing sides in old family conflicts. UC Berkeley offered me a full ride to study environmental engineering. Stanford followed with a similar offer. Even MIT expressed interest in my research. These opportunities represented the validation. I've been seeking my entire life proof that my intellectual abilities were real, valuable, and worthy of investment. You have choices now, David told me as I reviewed the scholarship offers. The world is recognizing your potential, and you get to decide how to use it. But perhaps the most important boundary I established was with myself. I decided that I would no longer diminish my abilities to make other people comfortable. I would pursue my interests with full intensity, celebrate my achievements without apology, and build a life that honored all aspects of my identity. Science competition trophies still sat on my desk, but it no longer represented just a personal victory. It had become a symbol of authenticity, the moment I'd stopped hiding who I was and started embracing my full potential. The family dynamics were still evolving, still fragile in some ways, but they were finally based on truth rather than careful deception. And while that truth was sometimes uncomfortable, it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged, not in one family or the other, but in the space I was creating that honored all the influences that had shaped me. 3 weeks after meeting David, our small town decided to honor my science competition victory with a formal recognition ceremony. The mayor's office had organized an event at the community center, complete with local media coverage and a celebration. That felt both overwhelming and long overdue. As I sat on the small stage, looking out at an audience filled with teachers, classmates, and community members, I felt a profound shift in how people saw me and how I saw myself. Mrs. Patterson, my chemistry teacher, spoke first. Emma has always been a thoughtful student, but I have to admit, none of us realized the depth of her scientific capabilities until this competition. Her victory has reminded all of us that potential can sometimes hide in unexpected places. The superintendent of schools presented me with a plaque recognizing my achievement, but more meaningfully, he announced that the district was establishing a new advanced science track to better serve students with exceptional abilities, who might not fit traditional gifted program criteria. Emma's success has highlighted gaps in how we identify and nurture scientific talent, he said. We're committed to ensuring no other student's potential goes unrecognized. When my turn came to speak, I looked out at the audience and saw my family sitting together in the front row. Dad was beaming with pride, clearly having moved past his initial discomfort with my relationship with David. Maria sat beside him, applauding enthusiastically, and Mom was crying, but for the first time in weeks, they seemed to be tears of joy rather than guilt. In the second row sat David, who had driven down for the ceremony at my invitation. Seeing both my fathers in the same room, celebrating my achievements together, felt like a moment of integration I'd been working towards since learning the truth about my parentage. 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. I was the family member who struggled academically, the daughter who couldn't quite measure up, the student who was pleasant but unremarkable. Winning this competition didn't just earn me recognition, it forced me to reconsider everything I believed about my own capabilities. I paused, looking at the faces in the audience, some surprised by my articulate confidence, others nodding with recognition. What I've learned is that potential doesn't always manifest in traditional ways. Sometimes it develops quietly, in private moments of curiosity and discovery. Sometimes it's hidden by circumstances beyond our control. And sometimes the people who love us most can inadvertently limit us by trying to protect us from disappointment. I could see Mom shift uncomfortably in her seat, but she maintained eye contact, accepting the general accountability in my words. This research project started as a personal curiosity about water purification, but it became something much larger, a journey toward understanding who I really am and what I'm capable of achieving. The trophy represents more than an academic victory. It represents the courage to pursue authentic interests, even when they don't fit other people's expectations. The applause was warm and sustained, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, during the reception, when community members approached me with a respect I never experienced before. Dr. Martinez, our family physician, shook my hand enthusiastically. Emma, I had no idea you were interested in environmental science. My daughter is starting high school next year and she's passionate about marine biology. Would you consider mentoring her? The question startled me. 6 months ago, no one would have thought to ask me to mentor another student. Now adults in my community were recognizing me as someone with valuable expertise to share. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor, approached with her grandson. Emma, would you tell Tommy about your research? He's been talking about wanting to be a scientist, and I think hearing from someone closer to his age might inspire him. As I explained my water purification project to an enthusiastic 10-year-old, I realized that my role in the community had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the struggling student people politely ignored. I was a resource, a mentor, an example of what was possible when young people were encouraged to pursue their passions. The most meaningful moment came when the local newspaper editor approached me with a proposal. Emma, we'd like to feature you in a regular column about young scientists in our community. Your research has applications that could benefit developing countries. Our readers would be interested in learning more about environmental science from your perspective. A regular column, my own platform to discuss environmental issues and inspire other young researchers. It was an opportunity I never could have imagined when I was hiding my interests to avoid family discomfort. During the reception, I noticed David talking quietly with my parents near the refreshment table. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language suggested a level of civility that gave me hope for future family gatherings. When the event wound down, both families walked me to my car, an awkward but significant moment of togetherness. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, Dad said, hugging me tightly, not just for winning the competition, but for handling all of this, the family complications, the new relationships with such grace and maturity. Mom's hug was more tentative, but sincere. I'm learning to be proud of all of who you are, she said quietly. It's an adjustment, but I'm getting there. David's farewell was brief but warm. I'll see you next weekend for our lab visit, he said. referring to the tour he'd arranged of his university's environmental engineering facilities. I think you're going to love seeing the graduate student research projects. As I drove home, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. The recognition ceremony wasn't just about celebrating past achievement. It was about acknowledging a future where my intellectual gifts would be nurtured rather than hidden. My phone buzzed with text messages from classmates who'd attended the ceremony, many expressing surprise and admiration for aspects of my personality they'd never recognized before. "Had no idea you were so brilliant," wrote Sarah, a girl I'd known since elementary school. "Your speech was amazing, so inspiring," texted Marcus, who sat behind me in calculus. These responses confirmed what I'd suspected. By hiding my true capabilities for so many years, I not only limited my own development, but denied my peers the opportunity to know who I really was. Ceremony had marked a public transition from the identity I'd constructed to protect my family's comfort to the authentic self I was finally ready to embrace. And while that transition was still ongoing, still complicated by family dynamics and emotional adjustments, it felt like the most important work I'd ever done. Tomorrow would